Today, Scotland's independence referendum, Apple and Google start encrypting, and Bitcoin fitting in. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening, and welcome to Liberties Report, week 38. This week's independence referendum in Scotland highlights a worldwide trend that appears to be accelerating. Trust in the nation-state, the government of countries as we know them, is eroding. That trust is eroding. Now, admittedly, Scotland did decide to stay in the United Kingdom, and the Union Jack is still flying over Edinburgh by a 55 to 45% margin. But this was still a much closer call than many would have expected, especially a couple of years ago. If Scotland had seceded, it would have set off an interesting chain of events, with the UK likely leaving the European Union, since the pro-EU people are found in Scotland, leaving the federalists in turn in charge of Brussels, which in turn would double down on the spiral of mistrust in the nation-state, since the European Union isn't exactly popular with the populace in Europe. But this is part of a larger pattern that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, where people either feel the need to protect themselves against their government, the government of modern countries, of the nation-state, or even downright try to evade it. Looking at Ferguson in the United States yet again, it's clear that an increasing number of people regard their government as an adversary. Indeed, a deadly adversary, quite literally. And this is where we come back to mass surveillance. This particular adversary has taken itself the right to listen to every conversation we make, to look at every piece of information we search for, and everything from our travel plans to our dating habits to our actual movement patterns are under the scope of this government. With spy agencies able to monitor everything we express and search for, this is the closest we've ever come to mind reading. And that's why it's important to remember that it doesn't stop there. This government doesn't stop at reading our intentions and emotions, frightfully and honestly forcing several reality checks. It apparently also decides to be able to change them. Facebook ran an interesting experiment in 2012, where they manipulated the newsfeed of just over 500,000 users, seeing if they could affect the emotional state of those users. And they could. It worked. That study had connections to the United States Department of Defense. Doesn't that make you feel safe already? This is why. As early as the early 1990s, a couple of people started arguing that encryption should be always on. It should be the default. Some people were very ahead of the curve and argue that there'll come a time when the government can listen to everything and anything, and therefore all communications, which was pretty much just email at the time, should be encrypted as standard. This effort was spearheaded by Phil Zimmermann, who wrote PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, which is still the standard in email encryption. And they were generally considered tinfoil hats, and it was only with Snowden's revelations starting last year, that perspectives started to shift. So this week, 20 years later, two corporate giants joined the battle against these curious governments, Apple and Google. Both of these announced that their future phones will be encrypted by default, with no option to turn on to be protected, to be encrypted. And this is enormous. It essentially means that the tinfoil hats who have been screaming about how necessary this is since the early 1990s have finally gotten heard. And this also means that by default, law enforcement and other government agencies can't read our private data as easily. Most importantly, big players are starting to take responsibility for people who don't have deep technical knowledge of security on their own. It used to be that if you wanted security, you had to learn it all by yourself, and that was a hard task. That was a hard, steep learning curve. And others taking responsibility for this is a landmark direction shift. And having big e-commerce players on board, this momentum marks a landslide distrust against the nation-state's government's abuse of privacy. And unfortunately, I'd had to say, the distrust is well deserved. Bitcoin plays in the same league. Imagine, who would have imagined 10 years ago that we would tell each other that we don't trust governmental money any longer. We don't trust central bank money. We don't trust the government to not cheat us out of our savings. So we are going to go with our own money? That was inconceivable. That was unthinkable. And then, of course, there are those who are really far ahead, like BitNation, who seeks to outcompete the nation-state government on its own home field. But even if that's far ahead at this point, it's all part of the same trend. People are starting to trust the government of countries, of nation-states, less and less. And it's finally becoming visible in action. I'm Rick Falkvinge, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.